Are you ready to get started with building a REST API with Spring Boot? Let's get started. My favorite place on the internet is Spring Initializer. This is where we would go to if you'd want to create Spring projects very easily. It's the website start.spring.io. I'll choose Maven as my build tool. I'll use Java as the language. And next, we will need to choose the version of Spring Boot. Typically, I'd be choosing the latest released version. We are recording this course with Spring Boot 3. And right now, there is no released version for Spring Boot 3 available. And that's why I would be choosing 3.0.0 M4. M4 here stands for a milestone release. If when you're watching the course, you see a released version of Spring Boot 3, for example, 3.2.0 or 3.1.0 or 3.5.0, I would recommend you to choose that. For now, I'll choose Spring 3.0.0 M4. Another recommendation is to avoid snapshots. You can see that there are 3 snapshot versions in here. These are versions which are under development. These are being currently developed by the Spring and Spring Boot teams. I would not recommend you to use the snapshot versions at all. Once you choose the right version of Spring Boot, we will get on to the project metadata. This is where we would configure the group ID and the artifact ID. Just like a class has a package name and a class name, similar to that, every project that you create with Spring Boot, you would need to assign a group ID and an artifact ID. The group ID we would be making use of is com.in28minutes.rest.web-services. And the artifact ID I would give it is RESTful Web Services. So group ID of com in 28 minutes REST Web Services, and the artifact ID is RESTful-web-services. I'll choose the defaults for the rest of the values. When it comes to the Java version, it is very, very important to remember that Spring Boot 3 only works with Java 17 or greater. So if you're making use of Spring Boot 3, make sure that you choose at least Java 17. Next, let's choose our dependencies. I'll go here and say add dependencies. We would want to build a REST API, and therefore I would choose Spring Web. Build web including RESTful applications using Spring MVC. This would use Apache Tomcat as the default embedded container. Let's add Spring Web. The next thing I would want to add in is JPA. We would want to make use of JPA and Hibernate to persist our data. And that's why we are going for Spring Data JPA. Persist data in SQL stores with Java Persistence API using Spring Data and Hibernate. Let's choose JPA. And we'll also add in H2. H2 database provides a fast in-memory database with a small footprint. We will get started with using H2 as the database, and at a later point, we'll switch over to MySQL. Let's use H2. And the last one which we would add in is Dev Tools. I don't want to restart the server every time I make a code change. That's why we are adding in Spring Boot Dev Tools. Spring Boot DevTools provides fast application restarts, live reload, and provides you with an enhanced development experience. So let's go ahead and pick this up. We are all set to create our REST API project. Let's go ahead and click Generate. Once you click Generate, a zip file would be downloaded to your local machine. What I would recommend you to do is to extract that zip file to a folder on your local machine. For example, directly into C:. I have extracted the content of the zip file to a folder on my local machine. It's called 02 RESTful Web Services. And now let's import it into our IDE Eclipse. You can do a file import, or if you see import projects, click that. So file import existing Maven projects is what we are going for. If you type in Maven, you should see existing Maven projects in here. So I'd go ahead and choose that. I would browse to the folder where we have extracted our zip file to. So this is the folder where I extracted my zip file to. So I'll go ahead and say open. And we are ready to import the project in. So let's say finish. If this is the first time you are making use of this version of Spring Boot, the import of the Maven project would take a long time, typically between 5 to 10 minutes. I would recommend you to wait until all the dependencies are downloaded by Maven. It took about 10 minutes for the entire project to be imported in, at the end of which, if I go to Project Explorer, I was able to see all the folders in RESTful Web Services project. you'd see a source main Java, source main resources, source test Java. You should see a number of Maven dependencies in here, and you should also see a pom.xml file in here. What we are seeing in here is the typical Maven project structure. Source main Java has the source code. Source main resources has all your configuration, for example, application properties. Source test Java is where you would write your unit tests. And pom.xml is where you define your dependencies. If I open up pom.xml, you should see a few dependencies in here. You can see that the dependencies which are present in here are Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring Boot DevTools, and you should also see H2. And these would correspond to whatever dependencies we have chosen on Spring Initializer. So Spring Web becomes Spring Boot Starter Web. Spring Data JPA becomes Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. H2 corresponds to the database which is in here, and DevTools is what we have in here. In addition, you would see an additional dependency called Spring Boot Starter Test. This is added in by default into all Spring Boot projects because this is what enables you to write unit tests with Spring Boot. We have our entire project ready. So let's see how to launch it up. If you go to source main Java and expand the package com in 28 minutes REST web services, RESTful web services, you should see a file called RESTful web services application.java. If you open this up, this is the Java file which you can use to launch up the Spring Boot application. All that you need to do is to do a right click, run as Java application. And you should see an application come up. You can see that the entire application launched up in less than 2 seconds. In this step, we created a Spring Boot project using Spring Initializer. We imported it into our IDE Eclipse, and we were able to run it successfully as well. If you had any problems with the import, I would recommend you to make sure that you are making use of the latest version of Eclipse IDE for Java EE developers. I'm sure you're having a wonderful time, and I'll see you in the next step.